Homeownership is supposed to be a dream. The neat little houses, the manicured sidewalks, the sense of safety that comes from living in a community where everyone takes pride in their property. At least, that's what I thought when I bought my first home. It was a modest single-family house with a small front lawn, a patch of backyard space, and a sturdy little driveway. Nothing fancy, nothing extreme. Just a place where I could start a new chapter in life, but there's something they don't tell you when you sign the closing papers. Something that doesn't come with the realtor's cheerful smile or the mortgage broker's stack of contracts. That something is the Homeowners Association, the HOA. And for some unlucky homeowners, the HOA isn't about community or care. It's about control. The first few weeks were quiet. I unpacked boxes, painted walls, and adjusted to the wah rhythm of the neighborhood. People waved when they walked by. Dogs barked from behind fences, and every house seemed the same. Trimmed hedges, green lawns clipped to regulation perfection. Mailboxes all lined up like soldiers. The kind of uniformity that makes you wonder if someone, somewhere, was checking every blade of grass. And in fact, they were. It started with a letter. A plain white envelope tucked neatly into my mailbox with the HOA logo stamped in bold at the corner. I didn't think much of it at first, probably a welcome packet or some kind of newsletter. But when I opened it, the cheerful anticipation drained from my body. Inside was a notice, printed in cold, bureaucratic language, informing me that my lawn had been deemed non-compliant. The grass apparently was insufficiently maintained, with uneven growth and visible brown patches. For this, I was being fined $200 for grass. I stared at the letter, disbelief turning into irritation. Sure, my lawn wasn't perfect. I had just moved in after all, but it was hardly an eyesore. A few patches here and there, nothing a little time and water wouldn't fix. Yet here was the HOA, acting like I had planted weeds the size of palm trees in the front yard. I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe some overzealous board member had been too quick to send out a notice. So I called the number at the bottom of the page. What I got wasn't reassurance. It was a reminder of just how strict this community could be. The voice on the other end, clipped, polite, and utterly uninterested in hearing me out, explained that all lawns must be maintained to community standards. That meant a consistent, lush green surface with no patches, no weeds, and no uneven growth. The rules, they said, applied equally to everyone. If I wanted to appeal the fine, I could attend the monthly HOA board meeting. Otherwise, payment was due in 30 days. See, Seth hung up the phone with a bitter taste in my mouth. It wasn't about the grass anymore. It was about control, about power, about the fact that the HOA didn't see homes as personal spaces. They saw them as properties to be policed, rows of boxes meant to fit neatly into their vision of perfection. Paid the fine, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't want trouble so soon after moving in. Still, the resentment burned. Every time I watered my lawn, every time I glanced out at the perfectly manicured yards around me, I felt the sting of that letter. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And then came the second letter. This time, the fine was $300. My non-compliance had apparently worsened. Despite the fact that I had reseeded the patches, laid fertilizer, and watered every evening, the HOA decided my grass wasn't improving fast enough. According to them, my lawn reflected poorly on community standards. That was the moment something snapped. I realized no matter what I did, it wouldn't be enough. Perfection wasn't the goal. Obedience was. The HOA didn't want me to fix my lawn. They wanted to remind me that they were in charge. And if I let them win now, I'd be trapped under their thumb forever. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with the second fine in my hand, I made a decision. If the HOA thought my lawn was a problem, I was going to give them a lawn they'd never forget. Not just a patch of grass, not just a yard, a statement. I wasn't going to fight them blade by blade. I was going to turn the very thing they hated into something bigger, louder, and completely impossible to ignore. I was going to turn my lawn into a jungle. At first, the idea seemed ridiculous. A jungle in the middle of suburbia, with rows of identical beige houses and neatly clipped shrubs? It sounded insane. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If the HOA wanted uniformity, I'd give them the opposite. If they wanted control, I'd show them what freedom looked like. And if they wanted to bury me in fines, I'd bury them in greenery. I began sketching out plans, browsing online gardening forums, and researching exotic plants that could survive in my climate. Palm-like ferns, climbing vines, towering ornamental, grasses, vibrant flowers that bloomed like fireworks. I envisioned a front yard that looked less like a suburban lawn and more like a slice of the Amazon. The HOA wanted compliance. I was going to give them chaos. As I made my list of plants, tools, and supplies, I felt the bitterness in my chest start to fade. For the first time since moving in, I wasn't angry. I was excited. The HOA thought they could control me with fines. They had no idea they had just sparked the wildest project of my life. But even as I planned, I knew one thing for certain. This wouldn't be easy. The HOA would fight me every step of the way. Neighbors would gossip, board members would send more letters, maybe even threats. But I didn't care. If they wanted a war over grass, I was ready to bring the jungle to their doorstep. What started as a $200 fine was about to spiral into a battle that would shake the entire neighborhood. And I had only just begun. The first step was preparation. If I was going to transform my front lawn into a jungle, I couldn't just start tossing plants into the ground at random. I needed structure, strategy, and a vision. The HOA thrived on order and rigidity, so the EU's best revenge would be to outplan them. They wanted compliance through conformity. I would achieve defiance through design. I spent nights poring over gardening websites, exotic plant guides, and forums where homeowners shared tips about landscaping projects. I looked at plants not as decorations, but as tools of rebellion. Some would grow tall and imposing, towering over the neat hedges of my neighbors. Others would creep and spread, vines and ground covers that would smother every inch of soil. And then there would be the flourishes, the bright, explosive colors that would make my house look less like a suburban box and more like a scene out of a travel magazine. I ordered seeds and saplings online, boxes of soil enhancers, heavy duty, planters, and trellises. Deliveries began arriving in waves, large cardboard boxes stacked at my doorstep like presents for a holiday only I knew about. My neighbors started to notice. Curious glances turned into raised eyebrows. Whispers drifted. Across the street, someone even asked if I was starting a greenhouse business. I just smiled and said I liked plants. The truth was far more entertaining. The first weekend, I got to work. I mowed down what little grass I had left, stripping the yard back to dirt. If the HOA wanted to fine me for grass, I would give them no grass at all. From there, I dug deep trenches, mixing in soil rich with nutrients, the kind used for tropical growth. The smell of fresh earth clung to my gloves as sweat poured down my back. The sun was hot, but my determination burned hotter. I started with the foundation plants, broad-leafed tropical varieties that would create the dense undergrowth. Elephant ears, banana plants, and ornamental grasses went in first, their leaves already stretching outward like hands eager to claim territory. Next came the climbers, jasmine vines, passion flower, and creeping fig. I positioned trellises and lattice work near the edges of my house, giving the vines a place to crawl and climb. With time, they would weave themselves into thick green curtains. That made my house look less like a home and more like a ruin reclaimed by nature. Neighbors slowed down as they walked past, pretending to tie their shoes or check their phones, but really watching every shovel I dug. Some looked amused, others horrified. In a neighborhood where conformity was king, I was a heretic. By the end of the first week, my lawn no longer resembled a lawn. It was the beginning of a wild experiment, a messy patchwork of plants stretching out of the soil in every direction. But it wasn't chaos, it was calculated. Every plant had a place, every corner had a purpose. Then came the accents, bird of paradise flowers with their flame-like petals planted near the walkway, hibiscus bushes along the fence line splashing, crimson and orange in the sea of green. I even added a dwarf palm tree in the center, the crown jewel of my rebellion. It wasn't just a yard anymore, it was becoming a statement. And that's when the first HOA letter arrived. This one was written with far less courtesy. It accused me of unauthorized alterations to the property and demanded that I restore my lawn to community standards immediately. Failure to comply, it said, would result in escalating fines. I held the letter in my hands, read it twice, then pinned it to my refrigerator like a badge of honor. It meant they noticed. It meant I was getting under their skin. So I doubled down. I installed a small fountain in the corner, its trickling water echoing against the leaves. I placed large decorative stones around the garden, the kind you'd see in a tropical resort. I added solar lights along the edges of the path, so at night my jungle glowed with an otherworldly aura. Each change made my property look less like a problem and more like a destination. But with every addition, the HOA's fury grew. Another letter, then another. Threats of fines climbing higher and higher, demands for emergency hearings. They wanted me to back down, to surrender, and fall in line. Instead, I smiled and ordered more plants. The neighbors, meanwhile, began to divide into camps. Some admired what I was doing, quietly telling me they loved the color and variety. They said my yard had personality, unlike the cookie-cutter sameness of everyone else's. But others saw me as a threat. They muttered about property values, about how my jungle would bring down the entire neighborhood. I knew exactly which group had the ear of the HOA board. One evening, as I watered my plants, I noticed a pair of HOA board members standing across the street, clipboards in hand, whispering and pointing at my yard. They thought they were discreet, but I could see the panic in their faces. To them, I wasn't just breaking a rule, I was challenging their authority, and authority was the only thing they had. As the days turned into weeks, the transformation accelerated. The vines began to climb, the grasses spread, the flowers exploded into bursts of color. My house looked alive, wild, untamed. The air itself seemed different. Thicker, greener, fragrant with blooms. When the wind blew, the leaves rustled together like a living chorus. What had once been an ordinary suburban lawn was now something extraordinary. Something the HOA couldn't ignore, and something they couldn't control. Of course, they weren't going to sit quietly. The next letter I received wasn't just a fine. It was a threat. The HOA declared my yard a public nuisance and warned that they could pursue legal action if I didn't comply. They accused me of lowering property values, violating community aesthetics, and creating a safety hazard. A safety hazard because of plants. I laughed when I read it. But underneath, the laughter was a flicker of unease. Legal action was no joke. The HOA wasn't just angry, they were escalating. And if I wasn't careful, I could find myself in the middle of a legal battle that would drain me dry. Still, I wasn't about to back down. I had come too far, invested too much. The jungle was no longer just a project, it was a symbol. And if the HOA wanted a war, I was ready to give them one. As I stood on my porch that evening, looking out at the lush greenery that had once been my front lawn, I felt a surge of pride. The HOA thought they could fine me into submission. Instead, they had awakened something they couldn't control. But deep down, I knew the real battle hadn't even started yet. The jungle was growing, and so was the storm it had created. And soon, the entire neighborhood would be caught in the middle. By the time my jungle reached its third month of growth, the neighborhood was no longer just curious. They were divided. For every neighbor who praised the color and uniqueness of my yard, there were two who muttered darkly about standards and property values. The HOA had fanned those flames with their letters, carefully worded reminders to the community that rules were what kept us civilized. And according to them, I was tearing that civility apart. The first real strike came in the form of an official summons. A thick envelope landed in my mailbox, heavier than the fines that had come before. Inside was a formal notice. I was required to appear before the HOA board at the next monthly meeting to answer for ongoing violations. The language was cold, bureaucratic, and dripping with authority. If I failed to appear, the letter warned, the board would move forward with legal enforcement. For a moment, I considered skipping it. But then I realized something important. This wasn't just about me anymore. The HOA wanted to make an example out of me. If they could crush my little jungle, they could remind the whole neighborhood what happens to anyone who steps out of line. And I wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. The night of the meeting, I walked into the community hall with a calmness I didn't quite feel. The room was filled with folding chairs, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and rows of neighbors, waiting to see what would happen. At the front, behind a long table, sat the HOA board. Clipboards, files, and water bottles neatly arranged like weapons on display. They read out my list of offenses. unauthorized removal of turf grass, unauthorized planting of non-approved vegetation, unauthorized installation of decorative structures, a blatant disregard for aesthetic harmony. Each phrase was delivered with the seriousness of a criminal indictment. To them, my jungle wasn't just messy, it was an act of rebellion that threatened their entire system. I stood quietly, listening to every word, letting the weight of their accusations hang in the air. And when they were finished, I gave my response, that I was cultivating a garden, not a nuisance, that my plants were beautiful, thriving, and well-maintained, that the HOA's obsession with uniform lawns was outdated and petty. My words weren't fiery or loud. They were calm, deliberate, and confident. I could see it unsettled them. Some of the neighbors in the audience nodded. Others glared. The board members whispered among themselves, clearly frustrated that I wasn't crumbling under their pressure. Finally, the president of the HOA announced their decision. I had 30 days to restore my lawn to community standards. If I refused, the HOA would pursue legal remedies, including fines, liens, and possible foreclosure. That was their trump card. Foreclosure. The nuclear option. They were threatening to take my home. I left that meeting with my heart pounding, anger boiling beneath the surface. They weren't just trying to control me, they were trying to ruin me. The very next day, I began phase 2 of the jungle. If they thought I would cave, they had underestimated me. I doubled down, expanding the garden further. I planted bamboo along the fence line, knowing it would grow tall and fast, creating a natural barrier that blocked views from the street. I installed hanging planters from my porch, filled with trailing greenery that cascaded like waterfalls. I even set up a small wooden pergola covered in climbing vines, turning my front yard into something that looked more like a tropical retreat than a suburban lawn. The HOA didn't sit idly by. They launched a campaign. Flyers began showing up in mailboxes, warning residents that non-compliance endangered property values. Rumors spread that my jungle was attracting pests, that snakes were nesting in the undergrowth, that my plants were a fire hazard. None of it was true, but the whispers worked. Some neighbors began avoiding me, crossing the street rather than walk past my house. Others stared openly, shaking their heads. And then came the inspections. The HOA board members began showing up unannounced, clipboards in hand, taking photos of my yard. They would stand there for half an hour, muttering to each other as if documenting every leaf. Once, I caught one of them leaning over the property line, measuring tape stretched across my flower beds. It was harassment, plain and simple. But harassment only fueled my resolve. Every time they documented, I planted more. Every time they threatened, I built higher. My jungle wasn't just a lawn anymore. It was a living, breathing act of defiance. Of course, escalation comes with consequences. One morning, I stepped outside to find one of my ornamental plants uprooted, lying broken in the dirt. Another day, my fountain was tipped over. The water spilled across the walkway. It was clear that someone, whether a board member or an angry neighbor, had decided to take matters into their own hands. That was the moment the battle stopped being one-sided. The HOA had declared war on my jungle, and now the neighborhood itself was becoming the battlefield. Yet even as the attacks mounted, something unexpected began to happen. A few neighbors, quiet ones, the kind who usually stayed out of HOA business, started approaching me in secret. They whispered words of support, telling me they admired what I was doing. One even admitted they wished they had the courage to stand up to the HOA too. My jungle, wild and untamed, was becoming more than just my rebellion. It was becoming a symbol, but symbols attract fire. And the HOA wasn't finished with me yet. 2 weeks after the board meeting, I received a new letter. This, one not from the HOA, but from a law firm. The HOA had retained legal counsel. They were preparing to sue. The jungle was growing, the neighborhood was watching, and the HOA had just taken the fight to the next level. And as I stood in my yard that evening, surrounded by the lush greenery I had built with my own hands, I realized something important. This wasn't just about plants anymore. This was about freedom, control, and the right to make my home my own. The jungle had started as a fine. Now it was a war, and the next battle was about to begin. The letter from the law firm felt different from the HOA's earlier threats. It wasn't printed on cheap paper with a logo in the corner. It wasn't signed by a smug board president who thought their title made them untouchable. This was heavier, formal, the kind of letter written to intimidate. To remind you that someone with resources and connections was preparing to drag you into a system designed to bleed you dry. The words were sharp, written in the language of courts and statutes. The HOA had officially declared my yard a public nuisance and a violation of contractual obligations. They claimed I had agreed, when purchasing my home, to maintain my property to the standards of the community. According to them, I was breaking that contract, and if I didn't comply within 30 days, they would file suit seeking damages, attorney fees, and a court order forcing me to tear down the jungle. It was a direct strike at the heart of everything I had built. For a night, I sat in my living room with the letter spread out on the coffee table, staring at the words as though they might rearrange themselves into something less terrifying. Lawsuits weren't a joke. They cost money, time, and energy. The HOA had all three. They had dues, lawyers, and the blind loyalty of those too afraid to challenge them. Me? I had a bank account that wasn't built for endless court battles and a jungle in the front yard. But fear has a way of sharpening resolve. As the hours passed, I realized that surrender wasn't an option. If I gave up now, it wouldn't just be my lawn at stake. It would be every homeowner who ever dreamed of pushing back against an HOA. My fight wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who lived under the shadow of their control. So, I did what the HOA never expected. I hired a lawyer. The first meeting was sobering. My attorney, a calm man with sharp eyes, explained the reality of the situation. Yes, the HOA had power. Yes, they could pursue fines and even place liens on my property. But no, they weren't invincible. Homeowners had rights too, especially when it came to property use and freedom from overreach. The question wasn't whether the HOA could fight. It was whether they could justify their fight in court. And that's where things got interesting. My attorney pointed out that the HOA's rules, as written, were vague. Community standards wasn't a precise legal term. Nowhere in their bylaws did it say lawns had to be grass, nor did it forbid alternative landscaping. In fact, my jungle, while unusual, was still landscaping. It wasn't abandoned, it wasn't unsafe, it wasn't a nuisance in any legally defensible sense. If anything, the HOA's case relied on subjective opinion dressed up as law. Though, more he explained, the clearer it became. They were bluffing. They thought the threat of legal action would scare me into submission, but if they actually went to court, their arguments would crumble under scrutiny. Still, winning in court wasn't enough. I needed something more, something that would make the HOA think twice about pushing this any further. That's when I realized I had a weapon they couldn't control. Public opinion. HOAs thrive in silence. They count on homeowners being too embarrassed, too isolated, or too scared to speak out. But if you shine a light on their behavior, their power starts to wither. So, I took my story public. I reached out to a local news station, sending photos of my yard and copies of the HOA's threatening letters. Within days, a reporter was standing on my lawn, microphone in hand, asking me to explain why my neighborhood was at war over plants. I told the story exactly as it happened. A $200 fine for grass that wasn't green enough, a board that wanted total control, and my decision to respond by turning my lawn into something beautiful. The story aired that week, and the effect was immediate. Suddenly, my little suburban street was filled with strangers driving by slowly, snapping pictures of the jungle. Some cheered, others laughed, but all of them were fascinated. The local paper picked it up, then regional outlets, online blogs, social media feeds. My fight with the HOA became a spectacle, a small-town rebellion that resonated far beyond my block. The HOA board was furious. At the next meeting, they accused me of misrepresenting the community and damaging its reputation. But the damage was already done. People were talking. And the more they talked, the more support I received. Strangers sent messages telling me to hold strong. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now began speaking out, emboldened by the attention. The jungle wasn't just mine anymore. It was ours. Of course, the HOA doubled down. They filed the lawsuit just as they threatened, dragging me into the machinery of the legal system. Papers, hearings, motions. They wanted to drown me in procedure, to bury me under the weight of their persistence. But now I had two things they couldn't counter: a lawyer who knew their weaknesses and a community watching their every move. Each court filing became another story in the news. Each hearing was another opportunity for the public to see how absurd their crusade had become. The HOA, once the unquestioned authority, was starting to look petty, vindictive, and out of touch. And that's when the tide began to turn. The judge overseeing the case issued an order for mediation before the lawsuit could proceed. It was a chance, maybe the last chance, for both sides to resolve the conflict without going to trial. The HOA thought it was their opportunity to corner me. But what they didn't realize was that by dragging me into court, they had created a spotlight. They couldn't escape. Mediation day arrived. I walked into the neutral meeting space with my attorney at my side, calm and steady. Across the table, the HOA board sat stiffly, papers stacked high, faces tight with anger. They wanted me gone. They wanted the jungle destroyed. But outside that room, the world was watching. The question was no longer whether I could keep my jungle. The question was whether the HOA could survive the storm they had unleashed. And as I sat there, waiting for the mediator to begin, I realized something important. This wasn't just a battle over plants. It was a battle over control, freedom, and the right to stand against a system that thrived on fear. The jungle had brought us here, but the war was about much more than leaves and vines, and the real outcome was about to unfold. The mediation was supposed to be calm. That's what the mediator said when we sat down, hands folded, papers neatly stacked in front of us. This is an opportunity for both sides to find a resolution, she explained in a soothing tone. But calm wasn't on the agenda. The HOA had come armed with binders, legal threats, and years of entitlement. I had come with determination, a lawyer, and the quiet confidence of someone who knew the truth was on their side. The HOA's president spoke first. She launched into a tirade about community standards, harmony, and how my lawn was an eyesore. That endangered property values. She gestured to photos they had printed out, close-up shots of vines, flowers, and bamboo stalks, all framed as though they were evidence of a crime. Her voice trembled with frustration, not because of plants, but because someone had dared to say no to her authority. When she was finished, their lawyer chimed in. He used words like breach of contract, non-compliance, and injunctive relief. He made it sound as though my jungle was a lawsuit waiting to happen, a contagion threatening to spread across the neighborhood. Their goal was clear: scare me, corner me, break me. Then it was my turn. My lawyer spoke calmly, methodically, dismantling their claims piece by piece. He pointed out that nowhere in the HOA's bylaws did it mandate that front lawns must consist of turf grass. Landscaping was required, yes, but the type of landscaping was left deliberately vague. My yard, while unconventional, was maintained, safe, and aesthetically pleasing. He went further. He brought up the publicity. He explained how the HOA's heavy-handed actions had made them look like tyrants, not protectors of property values. Every fine, every threat, every legal filing had only made their case weaker in the eyes of the public. The mediator took notes, nodding. The tension in the room grew thicker. The HOA members shifted uncomfortably, their confidence starting to falter. They hadn't expected resistance this strong. They hadn't expected their own rules to be used against them. But they weren't ready to surrender. Not yet. As the session dragged on, their demands softened from complete removal of the jungle to significant modifications to reduction in size. It was desperation disguised as compromise. They wanted me to give them something, anything, so they could walk away claiming victory. I sat quietly, listening, then finally spoke. My voice was steady. I explained that my jungle wasn't a stunt. It wasn't neglect. It was my home. I had invested time, money, and care into creating something beautiful, and I wasn't going to rip it apart just to satisfy their obsession. With sameness, the mediator asked if I was willing to compromise. I said yes, but on my terms. I offered to submit a formal landscaping plan, documenting each plant and feature, proving it was deliberate and safe. I offered to trim back growth that crossed property lines, to maintain pathways, to ensure visibility near the sidewalk. Reasonable measures. But I made it clear, the jungle was staying. The HOA balked. They whispered among themselves, hissing like snakes cornered in the grass. Their president's face flushed red, her hands gripping the table. She wanted total victory. Anything less felt like humiliation. But their lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgent. The president's expression soured further, but she knew. They all knew. They didn't have the strength to keep fighting. The law wasn't on their side. The court of public opinion wasn't on their side. The The jungle had already won. The mediator looked at both parties and wrote down the terms. The HOA begrudgingly agreed to accept my landscaping plan. They couldn't fine me for plants. They couldn't threaten foreclosure. They couldn't demand destruction. They could only require maintenance. Rules that applied to every homeowner, not just me. It was, in every way, a victory. Not absolute, but decisive. Still, the battle wasn't over. When the mediation ended, the HOA president glared at me with a venom I'll never forget. To her, I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was a rebel who had embarrassed her, stripped her authority, and exposed the weakness of their system. Even as the papers were signed, even as the mediator declared the dispute resolved, I could see it in her eyes. This wasn't forgiveness. This was vengeance deferred. Outside the mediation room, I breathed the crisp air with relief. The jungle would live. The HOA couldn't tear it down. But I also knew something else. They wouldn't stop. Not really. They would bide their time, wait for mistakes, and look for new angles. To them, control wasn't just a rule, it was survival. And I had become their enemy. Back at home, I walked through the jungle as dusk settled in. The solar lights flickered on, casting soft glows against leaves and flowers. The air was alive with the scent of blossoms, the sound of rustling bamboo, the trickle of water from the fountain. It was peaceful, defiant, triumphant. Neighbors slowed. As they passed, some smiling, some shaking their heads. A few stopped to congratulate me, whispering that they had seen the news, that they were proud someone had stood up to the board. For the first time, I felt the tide turning within the community itself. My jungle wasn't just tolerated, it was becoming admired. But admiration has a cost, because as much as I had won, I knew the war with the HOA wasn't finished. They had lost the legal battle, yes, but prideful people don't forget humiliation. They plot. They wait. And as I looked out at my wild, thriving yard, I realized something important. The jungle wasn't just my rebellion anymore. It was my shield, my fortress, my reminder that standing up to bullies, no matter how powerful they seem, was always worth it. But I also knew the final chapter hadn't been written yet. The HOA had been forced to retreat, and now they would try to strike again. The mediation had ended with papers signed and terms agreed upon, but anyone who has ever dealt with an HOA knows that victory on paper doesn't always mean peace in reality. The board had been forced to accept my jungle, but they hadn't forgiven me for winning. To them, I wasn't just another homeowner, I was a threat. I had shown the neighborhood that their power wasn't absolute. And for people who thrived on control, that was unforgivable. At first, things were quiet. Too quiet. No new letters appeared in my mailbox. No board members loitered outside with clipboards. Neighbors began to relax, and for a short while, life felt almost normal. I spent my evenings watering plants, pruning vines, and enjoying the garden I had built. The jungle thrived, lush and wild, every corner bursting with color and life. But peace with an HOA is often just the calm before the storm. One morning, I woke to the sound of banging outside. At first, I thought it was construction on a nearby house, but when I stepped onto my porch, I froze. A landscaping crew, hired by the HOA, was standing on my lawn, chainsaws, trimmers, shovels in hand. They were preparing to cut it all down. I rushed out, demanding to know what they were doing. Their supervisor, a tired-looking man in a neon vest, held up a work order signed by the HOA board. According to the document, they had authority to restore my property to compliance. It was a blatant violation of the mediation agreement, a desperate last-ditch power play. I called my lawyer immediately. He told me not to touch the crew, not to physically interfere, but to document everything. So I did. I pulled out my phone and began recording. Every chainsaw, every trimmer, every word. I narrated into the camera, explaining that the HOA had violated a legally binding agreement, that they had no right to trespass or destroy my property. The crew hesitated. They weren't hired to get caught in a lawsuit. They were contractors, not soldiers in the HOA's war. The supervisor called the board president, his voice sharp and nervous as he explained the situation. By the time police arrived, called by a neighbor who thought the commotion was a fight, the crew had already packed up their tools and left. The HOA had overplayed their hand. Within hours, my lawyer filed an emergency motion in court. The judge, already familiar with the case, wasted no time issuing a restraining order against the HOA. They were barred from interfering with my property again, ever. If they tried, they would face steep financial penalties. It was the final nail in their coffin. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. The board's reckless stunt had backfired spectacularly. Even residents who once supported them began to question their judgment. "If they can try to destroy his yard," one neighbor whispered, "what's stopping them from coming after us next?" The jungle had become more than my rebellion. It was a symbol of resistance, proof that the HOA could be challenged and beaten. Neighbors who once frowned at me now smiled. Some even asked for advice on their own landscaping, wanting to add a bit of individuality to their cookie-cutter lawns. My once controversial jungle was now admired, photographed, even envied. The HOA board, humiliated and weakened, began to unravel. At the next community election, several members resigned. Others were voted out by residents tired of the drama. A new, quieter board replaced them, one more focused on real issues like safety and repairs, not lawn colors or flower beds. And me? I kept my jungle. Seasons passed. The plants grew taller, fuller, more vibrant. The bamboo along the fence swayed in the wind like sentinels. The fountain bubbled softly in the corner. A constant reminder of defiance turned to peace. At night, the solar lights cast a warm glow, transforming the yard into something magical. The fines, the threats, the lawsuits, all of it felt distant now. What remained was the proof that one homeowner could stand up against the machine of conformity and win. And as I sat on my porch one evening, the sun dipping low behind the wild canopy of leaves, I thought about the first letter I had ever received. $200 for uneven grass. That was how it started. A petty fine, a push for control. But what they didn't realize then was that control only works if people agree to give it. I didn't give it. And because of that, my lawn wasn't just a yard anymore. It was a jungle. It was freedom, and it was here to stay.